Good afternoon, everyone. We'd like to welcome everybody to today's Lunch and Learn, and we hope you are all staying warm. And our speaker today is Sarah Beth Dreiss. And Sarah Beth has always had a passion for education and growing educational opportunities for students. Her journey has taken different turns in the education sector thus far. Shortly before graduating from UVA in 2015, one of her friends introduced her to the Virginia College Advising Corps, and at that time, they were bringing on 4 schools in the northern neck of Virginia. And a few months later, she would be the college advisor in Richmond and Westmoreland counties in the northern neck. 2 years later, she would go on to be a special education teacher in Westmoreland County, and from there, she moved to Chesterfield County Public Schools and finished her time as a special education teacher in Chesterfield. Currently, she works as a Gear Up Virginia regional manager for the North Central region. And so, Sarah Beth, you are on.
All right. Thank you so much, Stacy. I appreciate the introduction. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen with everyone. All right. Okay. Hopefully you all can see my screen okay. If you can't, just let me know. And as a forewarning, I have a cat that likes virtual meetings, so she might pop in my screen. I apologize. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today. Over the next couple of minutes with you, my goal is to provide a broad understanding of disability rights and employment in higher education. I'm not a lawyer, as you gleaned from Stacy's introduction, but rather a practitioner. So if there's any specific questions related to legislation or legal framework, there will be several resources I'll share with you at the end, as well as when you receive the PowerPoint, which can help you with any specific legal questions that you might have. If at any time, though, you have a question, definitely put those into the chat so we can hang on to them and review at the end. All right, so for roughly our hour today, I'm going to cover some background information, including data, go over some federal legislation as well as state legislation, engagement with students and employers, and modes of collaboration between 3 as well as other state agencies, provide you with some good national resources, and then answer any questions that you might have. But first, I'd like to get a sense from you all, just because it helps me when it comes to explaining things or other acronyms. What is your level of comfortability on this topic? So you don't have to answer if you're not feeling comfortable, but if you'd like to share in the chat, one, if you don't have any knowledge on this subject. 2, if you're unsure, but maybe you have a little familiarity with it. 3, if you're feeling kind of in the middle or okay. 4, if this is like a good comfort level for you. Or 5, if you consider yourself an expert, just to kind of give me a sense of who might be in the room today. I'm not able to see the chat. Stacy, do we have anything in there? Oh,
We
I
have
can't hear you. There we go. Now I hear you.
mostly we have 2s and 3s, but we do have a couple 4s and 5s.
Oh, awesome. Well, that's great. Well, we welcome all different perspectives here, and whether this is the first time you're hearing about this or you're feeling like you're an expert on this issue, We are so happy that you're here. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and move us along. First, I want to just kind of give you guys a little bit of the background from kind of a national level and why hiring employees with disabilities is really important for innovation and progress.
All around the world, there's a huge disability employment gap. In most countries, the unemployment rate for people with disabilities is twice that of people without disabilities. Often, it's as high as 80%. There are over 1 billion people in the world living with a disability. To have 80% of us unemployed, that's so much untapped potential. As someone with a paralyzed arm and living with a mental health disability who's worked in the financial sector and entertainment and tech, I know that having a disability doesn't bar you from doing good work. So it's shocking to me that this disability employment gap is so persistent. In the US, the Americans with Disabilities Act prohibits discrimination in hiring and requires employers to provide reasonable accommodations. And studies show that companies who prioritize disability inclusion are more profitable overall. So what exactly is the problem? Recruiters, human resources staff, managers, they tend to think of hiring people with disabilities as a social good or as something they have to do to meet a quota. But they should be hiring disabled people because of our strengths and all of the value and innovation we can bring. Here are 3 things every workplace can do to truly welcome people with disabilities. It's not comprehensive, but it's a start. First, stop making assumptions. Our culture tends to treat disability as a medical diagnosis, a tragedy, or a charity case. And all of these things are rooted in pity. They prevent us from being seen as peers and equals. These assumptions lead to a lot of avoidance. People tend to not ask us about our lives and hobbies outside of work, or don't invite us to company social outings. There's so much fear about saying the wrong thing that instead people say nothing at all. They treat disabled people like we're invisible, when all we want is to be seen and heard and accepted like anyone else. These assumptions also make people jump to conclusions about what we can and can't do without even asking. For me, assuming I can't type because I can't use one of my arms, or assuming a blind person can't be an engineer, when to succeed at work, you need to have people who see your full potential, because without that, nobody wins. So please, take the time to get to know us, invite us to things, ask us the same kind of questions you would of any colleague. What drew you to this work? What are your goals? What do you hope to do from here? And listen to our answers, but also respect our boundaries. If there's something we're not comfortable discussing, we'll let you know. And anytime you feel unsure, just ask us privately so we can make those decisions. You can even start by saying, I'm still learning how to get better at talking about disability. Second, rethink accessibility and accommodations starting now. Disability takes so many different forms. It can be about someone's sight, hearing, or mobility. It can be ADHD, dyslexia, or chronic pain. About 62% of employees with disabilities have ones that are not apparent. So even if you don't think there are people with disabilities in your organization, there probably are. And that's why I strongly recommend that workplaces create spaces with disability and accessibility in mind. That way, you're paving the way for future employees, clients, and customers who might benefit from accommodations too. At one of my first jobs at an investment bank, the company did something cool. Within a month of starting, I and all other new hires got an ergonomic assessment of our workstations. They actually had a person thinking about my access needs in multiple ways, like getting a footrest and keyboard wrist pad, which a lot of colleagues got, to asking if I might benefit from speech-to-text technology because I type with one hand. I've always tried to find these little hacks to make my work environment more comfortable, but the fact that this person offered so many options proactively, it made me feel so welcome without making me feel like my needs were special. It would be amazing if every employer could do some version of this. I mean, why not? But there are also more simple things that can make an impact. Like, what about listing accessibility information if you're hosting an event? Or automatically turning on captions for video meetings? Another way to think about this is, what do my employees need in order to thrive? It starts with equipping people with a variety of tools. Third, embrace flexibility, like disabled people have had to do our whole lives. People with disabilities have been advocating for remote work environments and flexible hours for decades now. And it took a pandemic for the world to realize it could happen. All of a sudden, this thing that seems so wild has become commonplace. And this isn't the first time I can think of when an accommodation for people with disabilities ended up improving life for society at large. Audiobooks, curb cuts, closed captioning, even electric toothbrushes. Disability is so often the root of innovation. So as we get back to the office, let's remember that all of us can thrive with flexibility. For people with disabilities, let's provide the option to work remotely at the hours when we can be the most productive from wherever works best. I mean, some of us do great working from our bed. And really, let's hold on to the openness that we can work around everyone's needs. Let's keep finding ways to embrace flexibility as part of our company's culture. We know that companies need to work harder on hiring us, retaining us, promoting us, paying us fairly, and amplifying our efforts. To do that, we need to stop making assumptions, rethink accessibility, and embrace flexibility. That is what will help close the disability employment gap.
All right, well, I know that many of you are working with students, and so there are parameters in meeting the internship goals and requirements, but hopefully that video will provide you with some tips and other little things to talk to future employers or internship site hosts when you're trying to get a student placed. All right, so some background information for you all just to get started. Unfortunately, the landscape in Virginia looks pretty similar to the national landscape. Students with disabilities are enrolling at college at lower rates than their non-disabled peers. And people with disabilities are similarly underemployed or not employed. However, institutions of higher education in Virginia note that they are seeing an increase post-pandemic of students requesting services at their office. So you all will likely be seeing an increase of students with disabilities seeking internship opportunities. Disability or accessibility offices, sometimes called DSOs or ASOs for short, note that an increase in adult learners with disabilities, health conditions, complex or dynamic disabilities, meaning one or two documented disabilities, two or three documented disabilities occurring at the same time. ADHD, autism, and cognitive impairments are on the rise at their offices. We also know that students in Virginia are not disclosing that they have a disability. According to VDOE data, 42% of students with disabilities are enrolling in college. But when we compare SHEV data with these numbers, there's clearly a gap in students who are choosing not to disclose, which likely means that you're also seeing those students in your offices not disclosing. They might choose to not disclose for several reasons, but we do know that they are not as successful in college when they don't disclose. All right. So for today's discussion, it's important to kind of just establish what a disability means according to the law. There are several models of disability, but really we're seeing higher education and job sites kind of function with this medical model of a disability. So what does the term disability or disabled person means? It's someone who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities at that specific time. Someone with a record of it. So perhaps they're not having a symptom of depression or a symptom of anxiety, but they have a record or a historical record of having depression or anxiety. And then simply someone who is regarded. So perhaps you are perceiving that individual as going through a depressive episode, though they've never disclosed that to you. Even that we could categorize that person as having a disability. And you'll get this PowerPoint with all of these sources as well after this, and you can check out some more ADA definitions at the link below. All right, so to kind of center ourselves in why accommodations exist and what they look like, it's important for us to sort of talk about the legislation that's out there. So for the purposes of our discussion today, the Americans with Disability Act determines much of the protections and definitions for disability in the workplace. Section 501, 504, and 508 of the Rehabilitation Act may affect you or your students if they're working with any federal executive agencies, particularly when it comes to 501 or 508 of the Rehabilitation Act. For Section 504, which is the most broad, entities receiving federal funding can't discriminate on the basis of a disability. So that affects largely most of our institutions of higher education in Virginia. I also want to note, because your offices might be seeing or experiencing currently a transformation in digital technology because of these ADA Title II updates. And again, this PowerPoint will have links to take you to some of the language around ADA Title II updates and the WCAG 2 AA guidelines. That stands for Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. But essentially by April 2026, all digital PDF files, content on LMS, your research databases, all of those digital files have to be updated along WCAG 2 AA guidelines. So it's a big transformation that colleges are trying to work on right now. I won't talk too much about that today, but because that is something coming up, also wanted to make you aware so that as you're thinking about things for the spring semester, you can make sure that all of your digital files are in compliance with WCAG 2 AA. All right, so our federal legislation has goals for both the student and the employer or internship site host. One, at its core, it's really about non-discrimination. These are non-discrimination laws. Two, these laws open up the access points for people with disabilities by removing barriers. However, these laws are not meant to place an undue hardship on the employer or challenge the integrity of a college course. The ADA specifically says there's no fundamental alterations that are, if a fundamental alteration were to occur, then an accommodation doesn't have to be made. It can be pretty tricky as to what exactly fundamental alteration means because that's particularly subjective. The student has a right to confidentiality in all discussions with you and their employer regarding their disability and accommodations. The employer's responsibility is to coordinate accommodations through the interactive process with the individual. So that means that the employer internship supervisor is to review the essential versus marginal job duties. Essential job duties are the ones that accommodations are meant to be given for, whereas marginal job duties are essentially meant to be reassigned to another individual. And again, that's through the interactive process with the student. The employer is also meant to ensure equal access through the interactive process and uphold their responsibility to provide the accommodations agreed upon. The ADA also says that these are meant to be reasonable accommodations, but again, that's pretty subjective as to what exactly reasonable accommodation means, which is why this interactive process with the student and the internship site host or employer is really important, because that's kind of where the two will come to an agreement on what a reasonable accommodation looks like for this specific job. All right, so I know not as relevant when we're thinking about internships that might be for credit, but the ADA does define exactly what a covered entity is. So you can see here on the screen, private employers with 15 or more employees, state and local government employers, employment agencies, labor organizations, and joint labor management committees. So again, if you want to look at more specifically, what all Title I covers, that source there will take you to some really great employee guides for finding out more about ADA. All right, so I really like this chart because I think it presents some great information around the myths and the facts and when it comes to accommodations and speaking to employers or internship sites. So you can see, myth accommodations are expensive, but really they're not meant to be. Most, as you can see, cost less than $300. And several are no cost. A lot of assistive technology is free or is low cost. But I particularly want to draw your attention to the last section of the chart with medical documentation. as I mentioned, higher education often functions along the medical model of disability or looks at disability from a deficit approach. Um, the term functional limitation is what a lot of institutions of higher education use, which is often, looking at a student's medical documentation or educational or psychological scores from their K-12 paperwork. But I also want to note that this isn't necessarily a required document. There are no documents that are specifically stated as required proof of a disability in the ADA. If a student comes to you with their college accommodation letter, then that really should function as sufficient proof to establish a disability. I want to note that that doesn't mean that a student's accommodations will automatically transfer from the academic classroom into the internship site, because that's not exactly what that means. It's just sufficient proof to establish that this is a student with a disability, because the ADA does say a student is not to be given an undue hardship to go out and find more documentation, and nor do we want that for the student. If they come to you with medical paperwork, great. But if they have an accommodation letter from the college's disability services office, that really should be sufficient proof to determine the disability. The interactive process is where you will establish reasonable accommodations with that student. Which takes us to some really great conversations about state legislation. So the last two and a half, three General Assembly cycles, there's been some state legislation that's come out to really reaffirm the process by which institutions of higher education establish proof of a disability. And so two General Assembly cycles ago, Chev worked with Senate Bill 21 to establish that the IEP should be sufficient proof, that the Senate Bill 21 study looked at how colleges determine disability status. And that report found that IEPs should be accepted as sufficient proof of a disability. This past year, Chev studied the way that colleges make that determination by looking at IEPs and what documentation is, or what proof is within the IEP to determine eligibility for services, and kind of to make the determination about how to improve the IEP for accommodation transfer. And so both of those reports are on our Chev report website and also are linked here in the notes section when you get the PowerPoint, so you can find those. But the intent of these two bills is to make transitioning from from K-12 into higher education much easier for students. And so just simply through state legislation, you all might start seeing in the next couple of years an uptick of students disclosing their disability to the DSO or the ASO, and thus needing accommodations for their internship or job placements. And then lastly, the Virginia Technology Access Act is to improve the procurement process for vendors, making sure that vendors are adhering to accessibility standards. This sets any procurement process in state to purchase technology at the state level much higher than ADA Title II. So if you're needing to purchase some captioning services, you would follow the Virginia Technology Access Act, and that should put you in compliance and even above compliance of ADA Title II updates in April. And again, a link to that bill will be in the notes section of this PowerPoint. So if you have any questions, you can look further into that legislation. All right, so I'm just gonna check the time and make sure that I'm doing okay. Yes. All right, so we want to talk about ways to engage students, tools that you can use even when you are seeing students in your office. Going back to that disability definition number 3, those regarded as someone as having a disability. But universal design for learning is a really great way to build these accessible actions into your programming without the need of a student requesting additional accommodations. And universal design for learning is great for students with disabilities, but it's also great for English language learners. So it reaches a wide audience for sure. And I'm just going to show you a little video kind of summarizing UDL if you're not familiar with it. But Virginia Tech, University of Mary Washington, UVA are three that come to my mind that I know have UDL initiatives. And so there might be UDL initiatives on your campus or through the higher ed partners you work with that you could look into to getting more support from or some training with.
Imagine you went into a big clothes store and all that was on sale was one type of outfit, in one size, with no thought given to different individual body shapes or personalities. That would be crazy, right? Expecting everyone to be able to fit into the same size and express themselves in the same colour and style? Yet in many cases, that's exactly what is happening in our education system. When it comes to learning, variability is the rule, not the exception, and our college campuses are now grappling with the demands of an increasingly diverse cohort of learners, with increasing numbers of international students, students from different cultural and socio-economic backgrounds, mature students, and students with disabilities. Despite this, curriculums are still designed for the mythical average learner, and all are expected to engage and learn on the same terms. Not enough flexibility is built in at the design stage to give all students equal opportunities to learn in ways that play to their own strengths. So, how can our institutions respond to these challenges? Enter Universal Design for Learning, or UDL for short. UDL is an educational framework that guides the design of learning goals, materials, methods and assessments, as well as the policies surrounding these curricular elements with the diversity of learners in mind. The framework was developed by US organisation CAST and is based on research in the field of neuroscience. It promotes three core principles for educators to build into their teaching practice, calling on them to provide students with multiple means of engagement, representation, and action and expression. The framework includes a set of guidelines on how you can turn these principles into practice. For example, by fostering collaboration with the introduction of group work with clear goals, roles and responsibilities. By using different types of media to support learning and ensuring that all materials are accessible. And by providing a choice of assessment instruments while maintaining robust learning outcomes. You are probably already including some UDL elements in your practice without realising it, and there's much more to explore. So don't be afraid to let Universal Design for Learning give you a new lens through which to look at your teaching and learning practice and help you to better reach all of your students. For more information and resources, visit ahead.ie/UDL.
That's a really great website, but also CAST, which they mentioned, and I'll take us back to the previous site. So CAST, you can see here udlguidelines.cast.org. So if you go on cast.org, you can see a lot of professional development resources and things around the UDL principles. As you can see here, split up into engagement, representation, and action and expression. So just incorporating multiple means of all of these types of sections, making sure that as it says, universal design for learning is incorporated into all aspects of the higher education system, which is why there are a lot of big initiatives around UDL currently in higher education. VDOE is coming out with a series of webinars. One will be featuring UDL just for their dual enrollment push with your higher education institutions. So it's really starting to kind of grow wings and fly away, UDL, and we're just seeing a lot more engagement with UDL. So I highly encourage you to check this out when you have some time and see what you can build into perhaps your courses. If you have your students taking a course, what are some little things that you can do around UDL? In in your practices. All right. Okay. So I'm gonna now kind of shift gears. That was more institution-wide or kind of thinking about course-wide, but what are some little things that you can do to engage students kind of on a more individual level? And so I mentioned in the beginning how students with disabilities perhaps aren't disclosing at similar rates or as they were in K-12, or simply aren't disclosing at all, or they aren't disclosing until there's an emergency. And there are many different reasons, and really it's based on the individual as to why they're not disclosing. But research says, a lot of students still carry a stigma with them about this paperwork that followed them through K-12. Now in higher education, they kind of want to leave that stigma behind. They don't want that label. They want to go out on their own and try it on their own. Some of them may not have their parent advocating for them. The parent advocacy piece is huge. I mean, that's one thing that we found in our House Bill 1805 study at Chev, was that our institutions of higher education are really seeing the parents still wanting to be involved in higher education, and that's just not the case. It's just simply because of FERPA. And so that might be a really big change for the student. But if they really need the accommodations, then most of the time they don't request them until they fail a class or they have a mental health emergency. And so building that trust in your offices or in your workings with students is super important from the beginning, regardless of whether or not they have a disability, but just making sure that they see you or your office as a trusting environment where they feel comfortable disclosing, and that they kind of get a sense that it's stigma free. So when working with students, I usually share that I'm someone with a disability, and that helps me build trust with them because they know they can trust me to keep their disability confidential. And I share with them knowing that I'm probably a person they can trust because I have a similar lived experience. So just sharing your personal story sometimes can help to really break down those walls. Again, the trust building comes in emphasizing confidentiality. So all of these interactions, especially when a student discloses to you, all of that has to remain confidential. And so always emphasizing confidentiality, especially in the disclosure and accommodations process. If you're unsure about what types of accommodations might be beneficial for a student, working with your disability or accessibility office at your university or college might be helpful. However, you still have to make sure that those interactions and conversations are confidential, because that student may have chosen to only disclose with you and not with the DSO or the ASO. So, if they're bringing you medical paperwork, that doesn't necessarily mean that they have disclosed with the DSO or ASO. But if they bring you an accommodations letter that has the letterhead of the college on it, you're safe to assume that they have, but you still want to make sure that all the interactions, no student names are used in conversations with DSO or ASO around, what their recommendations might be. Asking the student, hey, can I contact your counselor at the DSO or the ASO and reach out to them about what types of accommodations they might feel would be helpful in this internship setting. Seeking the students' permission to do that certainly shows you support them, and you're also working to build trust with them. I keep mentioning this term interactive process. It really is an interactive process between you, the employer or internship site host, and the student, to determine with them, once they disclose, what these reasonable accommodations might be. A lot of students might come in from K-12 into higher education with modified work allowed in the IEP. But we know that in higher education, modifications to a course are not permitted under the ADA because it would affect the integrity of the course, and accommodations are meant to remove barriers for access, not create that term fundamental alteration. So helping that student understand that, these are the essential job duties. These are the reasonable accommodations for the essential job duties. And here's why, and explaining that through listening to the students' concerns, validating the students' concerns around reasonable accommodations, again, is another great way to build trust with that student and help break down any stigma issues. And if a student is not willing, or is not willing to listen to you around what you perceive as reasonable accommodations, bringing in a different perspective is always a good idea. Again, remaining confidential and asking the student for their permission, to bring in a second voice. But the student also has the right to a grievance process if they feel that their accommodations are not being sufficiently met, or their disability access barriers are not being efficiently met. So assistive technology is, again, one thing that you can implement easily into your courses, the internship site, the job site, whatever it might be. There's a lot of assistive technology that's free. If a student that you're working with is a client of DARS, Department of Aging or Rehabilitative Services, or DBVI, Department of the Blind and Visually Impaired, DARS and DBVI sometimes are able to purchase assistive technology for students that might need it. So it's also a great way to get connected, and I'll share a little bit of collaboration on another slide, but a great way to find a collaborative partner to help a student get assistive technology that they might need to be able to work at an internship. At the bottom of this in the notes, and again, you'll get the PowerPoint at the end, there's a link that will take you to our Level Up Virginia website, and that has a whole list of different types of assistive technology that institutions of higher education are using, and if the AT is free or if there's a paid subscription. So you can see some examples on that sheet as well. So this slide is just going to give you some ideas about what specific accommodations might look like per disability. And then again, here, this link will take you to more accommodations, everything from pregnancy to autism, and more. So you can see, some basic accommodations that might be given. But I really like Caitlin's explanation, because she does kind of talk a little bit about the interactive process with her employer.
Let's talk about accommodations that can make employment sustainable for people on the autism spectrum. I work at a nonprofit serving autistic people, and here are some of my personal accommodations. I carry earplugs and fidget tools with me wherever I go, and I use them when the need arises. I'll never be able to accurately screen a session note for errors. This portion of my job has been removed. Instead, I've been trained on updating goals in a database. My employer has helped me set goals for timeliness, attending trainings, professionalism, and writing emails. They give me feedback on these skills, providing me encouragement as I become more independent. If I'm feeling overwhelmed, I can ask a supervisor to cover my responsibilities while I take a break in my car or a quiet room for 10 minutes. This allows me to collect myself before a meltdown happens. Supervisors have supported me in managing interactions with my coworkers, understanding and following policies, and helping with problem solving as needed. This gives me a familiar point of contact when problems do arise, and is again useful in preventing meltdowns.
So you can see in her example, which she shared about her accommodations, that interactive process and really real feedback is super important for her being successful. And so again, that may be what your students need, maybe not, but that interactive process is really important for the student to feel that their accommodations are being met, that they're being heard, and that it's a good environment for them. And this is a great way for them to kind of practice that interactive process in an environment that they might feel more supported in before they go out into the quote unquote real world after they graduate. So they can have someone like you around them supporting them through that. And again, practice that disclosure process with the internship site host or job employer. Always good idea to practice because the student may or may not choose to officially disclose in their salary job once they graduate too. So this is a great opportunity for them to even practice that disclosure. All right, I know that we are coming up on time, so just really quickly, some other points of collaboration to kind of think about. Obviously the student is going to be the biggest collaborator, and second, the employer or internship site. So that student input is going to be key to building trust and support. But the employer also should be able to provide feedback to the student about how they're doing. You saw Caitlin, she said that she gets feedback from her employer on the goals that they set for her. So goal setting, goal attainment, tracking, you may or may not be doing that in your internship depending on how it's structured for the student. But that's going to be really key for the student to also understand if the accommodation that they're requesting is actually beneficial for them. They might have an academic accommodation that works great in the classroom, but they don't necessarily need that accommodation when they get into a workplace setting. And so the student be able to provide feedback on that accommodation for themselves is a great learning moment and training for them for when they go into the workforce. There's other agencies out there to support you and your student. I mentioned DARS, Department of Aging and Rehabilitative Services. There's DBVI. A student might not know about DARS or DBVI. There's a lot more support from DARS now because school divisions are looking to partner more with DARS, but individual families may not even know that those agency resources exist, and it could be the first time that they're hearing about DARS or DBVI when they get to a career services office or even in the academic accommodations process. And then I mentioned the disability accessibility offices. Those are good collaborators when you might have a specific question about an accommodation. And then supervisors, like I mentioned, the supervisor feedback for the student is really important, but it's also important to make sure that supervisors have training around working with students with disabilities or that interactive process or the accommodations process as well. So making sure that they're familiar with ADA and Section 504, because ADA is law and it's not something that anyone has a legal grounds to say no on. And a lot of institutions of higher education are kind of working their way through that right now when it comes to professors not implementing accommodations in the classroom. So I'm sure that you could encounter some supervisors at internships that are less willing to implement accommodations. And that could be a really good insight for you and the student to say, this might not be the right match or fit for that individual. Because just like selecting colleges, match and fit for job sites is really important for students with disabilities as well, making sure that they have a good placement. As I mentioned, I'll skip over this, but you can definitely check out these stories. They're really great. Center on Transition Innovations at VCU spotlights several different young adults that are doing amazing things in higher education, training, employment. So this one was just about Marcus, a young man with autism that started his own food truck. And if we had time, I'd show it, but I encourage you definitely to look it up afterwards.
My name is John Marcus.
All right. And these are some of the resources that I mentioned. So I just want to point out the last two here, Job Accommodation Network. I've been referencing a lot of their resources throughout today. The Disability Law Center of Virginia is also a great resource specifically for any legislative questions or legal framework questions. The ADA National Network was the resource that I referenced at the beginning with the ADA definitions. And they do some training and support around fundamental alterations. I've mentioned DARS a lot, so here's a link that will take you directly there. And then VCU Research Training Center has a lot of research around employing students with disabilities and internships for students with disabilities. So definitely encourage you to check that out if you want to stay up to date on some of the research and technical assistance that's out there. And I think that takes us to questions. So I'll go ahead and stop see the chat. Do we have any questions?
If you don't want to speak out, you can put it in the chat also. I don't see any. You must have done a great job, Sarah Beth, that nobody has any questions.
Thanks. Well, I do see some familiar names and faces, so it's great to see. Great to see all of you, but wonderful to see some familiar names and faces.
Okay, well, if nobody else has any questions, if I'll get my colleague to go ahead and put the survey in the chat. If you will please fill out the survey. It's very important that you let us know, how we're doing, what would you like to see for 2026. So we value your input and want to thank Sarah Beth so much for joining us today. I mean, it was very informative, definitely something we can think about as we're working with students. So thank you so much for joining us. And so I hope everyone has a great holiday, and we're looking forward to seeing you next year. Thank you, everyone, for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.